This first 30 minutes of the course really sets the context for what we will be focusing on and what we will be learning and what background knowledge we may seek to develop, but which sits outside of the context of a carbon literacy course. We start with quite a complex graph, the 9 planetary boundaries, and then end with a fun exercise looking at greenhouse gases. I always tell learners before we get going that this is perhaps the most transmissive mode of engagement they'll have throughout the whole course, so I invite them to take notes, ask questions, and please stop us as we're going along. In this short video, again, I will run through the materials as I would during a regular staff course, and we'll try to build some resources and create a space for you to ask questions about these in our Miro board. So let's begin. I like to start every course with this 9 planetary boundaries graph, and I'll ask learners if anybody has seen this graph before, perhaps eliciting a show of hands. It's always useful to see if people have or if they haven't come across this piece of research. Invariably, not many learners have, so I then say, great, here's an opportunity to really set the context, and let's take our time by delving into each of these categories in turn. So this piece of research was developed over 15 years ago by the Stockholm Resilience Centre, and the number 2 on the bottom right will take you to this piece of research. What this team of researchers and analysts have done is categorise 9 of the Earth's ecosystems and what we're doing to overstep what we might call a safe operating space or a safe space for each ecosystem. This piece of research, as I mentioned, was first published over 15 years ago, but has been updated recently, and this is the most recent update in 2024. Recently, the research hit headlines in New York Climate Week as it was previously republished every 5 years, but now the data is going to be updated on an annual basis. So we'll expect this to become a much more prominent piece of research over the years to follow. But as it's relatively new for you all, let's spend some time really understanding this and going through each category in turn. So the first one I would like to draw our attention to is this safe zone, stratospheric ozone depletion. Here we are talking about the hole in the ozone layer. Does anybody know anything about the hole in the ozone layer that they could tell us? See what you pick up from learners here. Usually people will understand that the hole is a bad thing, or they might think that the problem is going away, or they might have heard something about aerosols, and some learners even point towards CFCs. The clarifying piece of information that I always give here is, yes, we need the ozone layer. The ozone layer protects us from radiative forces from the sun, and where we see a hole in the ozone layer, like the one recognised over Australia, but also over portions of Indonesia, Canada, we might see a rise in cancer cases. So this is an acute human health issue where there's a hole in the ozone layer. This hole was first recognised around about the 80s, and it was recognised as a result of a particular gas. This gas was CFCs, or chlorofluorocarbons, and they were contained in, yes, aerosols, but also fridges. So these were the main 2 proponents of CFCs being released into the atmosphere. Noticing this acute issue, over a period of time, a piece of legislation was developed called the 1987 Montreal Protocol. And the Montreal Protocol effectively, over time, banned CFCs from being used in aerosols and fridges. And over time, we've seen a rate of recovery in the whole of the ozone layer. So this is a super positive place place to start when we think about our Earth's ecosystems. And in fact, the Montreal Protocol is probably the most effective piece of climate legislation that's ever existed, keeping us within a relative place of safety where before we would have extended beyond. However, as we notice when we go around the graph, we extend beyond that place of safety in several other categories. It's useful to know about the ozone layer, but it's not something we're going to be talking about throughout the day, although I invite your conversations around it. We measure the hole in the ozone layer in a different way than we would measure climate change. So useful to know, but not what we're talking about in the context of this course. The next category, atmospheric aerosol loading, could be used to describe air pollution. And air pollution, again, has a really specific data measurement. PM2.5 is the data measurement used for air pollution, or particulate matter 2.5. This piece of research actually doesn't study air pollution on the local or ground level and its impact on human health. Instead, what it's looking at is pollutants in the northern hemisphere and the southern hemisphere and the difference between hemisphere pollution levels. The reason why this is significant is when there's an imbalance in our inter-hemisphere air pollution, we might see precipitation patterns altered or temperatures altered, so a rise in monsoons. If you're interested in air pollution more generally on a local level, I recommend the Air Quality Index as a fantastic resource to go and look at. Again, we won't be looking at it extensively in this course, but we might think about another course developed around air pollution instead. These are all interconnected, and perhaps none more so than ocean acidification and climate change. And let me explain why. So when there's more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, this carbon dioxide, as we know, is absorbed by the planet. It's absorbed by plants, so we breathe out carbon dioxide and plants are a natural carbon sink. Plants take this carbon and it's stored in soils, so soils are actually a natural carbon sink as well. But the biggest carbon sink in the world is actually our oceans. Phytoplankton in the oceans absorb carbon dioxide and they store carbon dioxide in the deep, cold depths of the ocean, the biggest carbon store in the world. However, in this process of carbon dioxide absorption, another sort of ecological overshoot occurs, and this is the production of carbonic acid. So when there's lots of carbon dioxide in the ocean, carbonic acid is produced and the ocean becomes more acidic. When the ocean becomes more acidic, we know that it leads to loss of forms of life. And the one that we really know is around coral reef systems, but also other sorts of plants or animals living in the ocean will be affected by this acidification. So it's a really important topic. It's something that is inherently linked to climate change, but it overspills the boundaries of what we're going to look at today. We're really going to be focusing on the top left, looking at climate change here today. The next category, biogeochemical flows, sounds quite difficult, but I wonder if anybody has any understanding about this. Here we have a P and an N. Maybe somebody might know what the P or the N might refer to, or I would take a guess. Does anybody want to guess what the P and the N might mean? Let's see what learners say. If they don't get it, we'll direct them towards the answer, which is phosphorus and nitrogen. So what we're talking about when we look at biogeochemical flows is really fertilizer use. So we need fertilizer. We've used it historically to grow crops, protect them from bugs, promote growth, and the growth through fertilizer in agriculture has also led to the boom in human population that we've seen over the past century. However, fertilizers also propose an ecological problem. Whenever fertilizer is used in an agricultural process, and here I'm really talking about traditional chemical fertilizers, that fertilizer will usually find its way to a water system. It will either leach through the soils or run off the top of soils. But what happens when fertilizer meets water is we see this phenomena occur called eutrophication, or in layman's terms, algae bloom. So algae, that thick green plant substance on the top of a river. The reason why this is an ecological problem is that algae, first of all, sucks up a lot of oxygen from a river system. It also blocks a lot of sunlight from a river system. So it makes it quite hard for other forms of life to exist in that body of water. And I say river here, but it could be a lake or a coastal area as well. Of course, there's other problems, acute problems with chemical fertilizer leaching into water systems, which are also addressed in this category as well. So a really complicated issue, one worth knowing about, but one that has a different data set to climate change, and so not data that we are looking at today. Everything up to this point has been quite complicated to understand. Thankfully, the next two categories are relatively simple. So with freshwater change, we would look at water as a precious commodity or resource. And in this piece of research, we study water in two capacities. We look at blue water, which is all the water that is naked to the human eye or which we could see. And we also look at green water, which is all the water that's stored in our soil systems, the water that's ready for plants to use. So here we might be looking at soil aridity. With land system change, as we've already explored, we need organic matter to absorb carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and store it in not only our visible plants, but also in our soils. So whenever we remove organic matter, and this would mean shrublands or forests, and we replace them with cities or agricultural lands, we remove the ability for this carbon to be sequestered in the environment. So here in the land system change, we're really looking at meters squared of transformation of land. And as you can see, we've overextended beyond the amount of land, natural land, that we should have to sequester greenhouse gases and store them in our natural carbon sinks. Moving up, biosphere integrity sounds quite opaque, but actually we understand this category, and what we're looking at here is biodiversity loss. So the rate of extinction for species of plants or animals. And when we look at the rate of extinction, we're really looking at that first category, the genetic category here, when we're just studying the rate of extinction. But in this piece of research, as you can observe, there's also a functional category present. And what we're doing through this category is really looking at what each species offers an ecosystem. So the easiest way to think about this is by looking at bees as pollinators, right? They have a really specific function in an ecosystem. We need bees, and everybody needs bees to perform this pollinating function. So we should study that species with a specific emphasis and weight that category slightly more heavily here in how we study biodiversity loss. Again, biodiversity loss, although an important thing to be considering and studying, is outside the parameters of our one-day course here. But I would say if you wish to explore biodiversity in your own time, I recommend the Living Planet Index as a first place to go. So, wow, we've already done 7 categories, and here we're just looking at climate change, CO2 concentration, and radiative forcing. When we look at radiative forcing, we're looking at the ability for our greenhouse gases, the gases that cause climate change, to either be absorbed by our natural ecosystems in the Earth, our biosphere, or to extend beyond our biosphere and into space. So really we're looking at the trappings of our atmospheric system here when we're studying radiative forcing. It's a complex subject matter, and one I'd recommend actually exploring in further depth in the resource itself by going to the Stockholm Resilience Centre. So we're going to zoom in on climate change, but there is one more category that we have to look at first, and this is our novel entities category over here. Does anybody want to take a guess at what a novel entity might mean? It's the only category that we haven't looked at so far. We'll elicit a few responses or guesses at this point to give you a moment to breathe. Let's see what learners come up with. And we would clarify by saying that a novel entity in this instance is really the study of man-made products or technologies that have a long-lasting impact on our environment. We're looking at products or technologies perhaps that leach into systems and don't necessarily biodegrade. So one we would look at is plastics as a novel entity. We might also look at forever chemicals as a novel entity. And we might look at radioactive substances and put them in this category as well. And you can see here that there's a slight blurring at the novel entity edge that's also repeated in the genetic category of biosphere integrity. This blurring refers to an increasing level of risk, a risk that could be modelled as much higher than the graphic or pictorial represents here. And we might think about this risk in terms of the long-term impact of plastics. As they stick around for such a long time, it's quite hard to extract them from the environment, so the risk increases and intensifies over this period of time. Equally, with genetic biodiversity loss, it's an increased threat and risk the further we go down the line of losing particular species. So, a really complicated picture to look at when we're understanding environmental impact, but it's one that we should always keep in mind, because if you are ever tasked with producing an environmental impact assessment report for any piece of work that you do, it wouldn't be that you would just be looking at climate change as a category. You may also be tasked with understanding a product's impact on ozone depletion, ocean acidification, its water use and its land use would definitely be categories that we would look at as well. But because this is so complex and we've taken a while to really go through each category, let's pause and see if there's any questions that you might have about this particular piece of research and what it's doing. After a moment to pause for questions, I always like to end this by asking a question to learners. And this question centers understanding around where the safe operating space exists, but also draws us back to our focus for the day around climate change. So very often a learner will ask around what is safe and what is dangerous in relation to each category. Well, with some this is quite simple. When we look at ocean acidification, for example, we would study a pH scale. The more acidic the ocean becomes, the more dangerous it is for forms of life, and therefore there is a number on the pH scale that we look at to define a safe boundary. And with climate change, we're also looking at a number. This number is, in simple terms, how hot the world can get before it is deemed unsafe. And we always define this number in relation to the pre-industrial era. So we look back at the world's temperature in the 1850s, and then we take an average temperature rise over time. Does anybody know how hot the world can get before it is deemed unsafe? See what learners know. They might think 2 degrees. They may not know at all. After a moment to pause, I would say 1.5 is usually the number that learners have heard of. This 1.5 degrees was agreed during the 2015 Paris Agreement, and it was a global target set to limit global heating within a safe level or relative safety. At the 2015 Paris Agreement, all the countries who entered it set a nationally determined contribution. So they have their own targets of reducing greenhouse gas emissions to keep within this 1.5 degree boundary. However, in recent years, we started to realise that we're extending beyond this much sooner than we anticipated. In fact, last year, 2024, was the first year on record where every month in the year was on average 1.5 degree or more hotter than before pre-industrial times. There are also models of 2 degrees and 3 degree limits, all with their own relative threshold of safety and unsafety. So monitoring the risks that might be associated with a 2 degree or 3 degree heating. However, the interesting thing about this piece of research is that it doesn't say 1.5 degrees is the safe operating space. Instead, scientific consensus points towards 1.1 degrees as the safe operating space for climate change. And in fact, we extended beyond 1.1 degrees quite a few decades ago. And we can recognise this in the media. We've seen for a long time floods, droughts, wildfires increase. This isn't a phenomena that has happened in the past 5 years. It's just intensifying and intensifying. So when we look at a space of safety, 1.1 degrees would be the ultimate goal. 1.5 degrees is a political ambition. And anything beyond this extends into a place of relative instability and volatility in terms of our climate system. But look, this is a lot to unpack at the very start of our session. So we are going to take a step back and really understand what climate change is and how it occurs. I like this as a complex overview. And now let's simplify. So, can we answer the question, why is climate change happening? Of course, that's a layered and complicated question to answer, but in scientific terms, perhaps we could answer it quite simply when we look at greenhouse gases. So climate change is happening because of greenhouse gases in our atmosphere. And greenhouse gases are mostly natural gases, and we actually need greenhouse gases on Earth for it to maintain a stable temperature that's livable for us as humans. In fact, if the Earth wasn't full of greenhouse gases, its temperature would be around minus 20 degrees. We wouldn't be able to live on Earth. So greenhouse gases, in a sense, are good, and what we're just doing is we're adding greenhouse gases to the atmosphere, bit by bit. As these gases trap heat, we're also adding heat into our atmosphere, bit by bit. And I say our atmosphere, but here I'm talking about our troposphere. Our troposphere is our lower atmosphere. It's anywhere from ground level to around about 10 kilometers up. Above our troposphere is our stratosphere, where our ozone layer is. Our mesosphere is above that, and it is very cold. Our thermosphere is very hot, and our exosphere separates us from space. Each of these atmospheric layers have different conditions. Today, we're just studying our troposphere, our lower atmosphere, as this is where our weather conditions take place. The difference between climate and weather is a matter of time. So when we look at weather conditions, it's a day-to-day basis. And when we study climatic conditions, we look at a period tends to be of around about 30 years. So when we study climate change, we're looking at a longer period of time for change. So in effect, it's quite a simple question to answer when we look at climate change. However, what is more complicated or might throw you is what greenhouse gases exist that contribute to climate change. And this is our first task for you. So I would like you to separate into pairs, and I'm going to give you 2 minutes. Can you identify the 6 greenhouse gases on our board? I've given you one, by the way. Carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas. That's in orange. So really, you just have to find 5 greenhouse gases. 2 minutes on the board. Let's see what you know. In this exercise, we have one pair at a time come back and give their answer. We'll see if everybody gets it right. And there's a bit of learning here to understand which of our greenhouse gases are on the board and which aren't. So we'll provide the resource giving some detail about each gas here and what we might say in this context. Depending on whether you're delivering in an online or in an in-person context, this would differ slightly. If the learning were in person, we would imagine, yes, giving 2 minutes for learners to discuss answers and compare between one another. If you're online, I would choose a learner from the list and call upon them to give one greenhouse gas and see how much they know, and then call upon the next person, and so on and so forth. Once you've elicited at least 5 or 6 of the gases on the table, see where you get to. You may not get all of the greenhouse gases. You may make a few mistakes along the way, but give a decent amount of time to go through some of them. And then maybe around the 6th one, I would stop and pause the exercise. This would be the end of what you're delivering for this session. So I would also say, we're about to reveal the greenhouse gases, but this is where your teaching portion ends. So thank the learners for their time and pass over to the next trainer.